Yep, I'm fixing that right now.
All right, thank you. So one of the interesting things, of course, is that if you stop and you think, it really doesn't make much sense that two of the most important and famous armies of the war between the states would basically do nothing of importance or much of anything at all between the Battle of Gettysburg and the start of the Wilderness Campaign. As I started to look into this period, courtesy of a conversation I had with one of my professors in the second half of the war in 1863, I discovered that, in fact, a great deal had happened during this time period. And so I started to read about it, research it. There weren't any books on the library shelves that talked about this period, an occasional reference in a regimental history here and a biography there. And so it meant going into the official records and the newspapers and all of this. And I discovered that, in fact, there was a great deal that happened in the second half of 1863. Neither Meade's army nor Lee's army was quiet. There was a great deal of campaigning, a lot of marching, a substantial amount of fighting. There was always the possibility that this would escalate into a major confrontation on the scale of a Chancellorsville or Fredericksburg or an Antietam or something like that. It didn't, of course, get to that point, but it was always a possibility. And what happens in the second half of 1863 really sets the stage for what's going to happen in the spring campaign of 1864. You can't get from Gettysburg to the Wilderness without looking at what Meade and Lee are doing in this period after Gettysburg and before the arrival of Grant. Of course, the story really begins at a point that most people believe constitutes the end of the Gettysburg campaign, the great battle in Pennsylvania, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, which saw Lee's army retreating back toward the Potomac River. And that retreat is very well covered in a lot of great books written by really great historians that take you to the point where Lee finds himself backed up against a flooded Potomac River. The bridge he'd left behind near Williamsport had been destroyed by Union cavalry on July 3rd, an all-around bad day for the Army of Northern Virginia. River's not fordable, and so Lee gets there. The Federal Army is in fairly close pursuit, and the Confederates have to turn and face their pursuers and be ready to fight a battle while Lee's engineers are cobbling together a bridge. The Confederates are using ferries to send wounded back across the Potomac and bring fresh stocks of ammunition over onto the Maryland shore. But for a lot of people in the North, and especially in the administration of Washington, D.C., this looked like an opportunity to finish off the Army of Northern Virginia once and for all. There was certainly a lot of pressure on Meade to do that. There was an expectation among his troops that they would be thrown at the Confederates, that there would be one final decisive battle. And if Lee's army could be destroyed on the north bank of the Potomac and taken together with Grant and Banks' recent victories along the Mississippi River, they would go a very long way toward ending the war. Closer to events, however, it was not so easy as that. The Army of the Potomac had been as badly hurt at Gettysburg as the Army of Northern Virginia. The march toward the Potomac had been as miserable for the Federals, who were basically short of everything during the pursuit. Union troops were marching without shoes, some of them actually walking in their underwear because their pants had worn out, a condition that we more commonly associate with the Confederates. So both armies were wounded animals by the time that Meade gets to Williamsport and finds the Confederates dug in with their flanks anchored on the Potomac. As Meade comes up, he plans a reconnaissance in force to see if he can find a weak point in the Confederate line. He decides to delay at the advice of many of his officers, wait for some reinforcements to come up. Meade does not believe that Lee's going to be capable of escaping across the Potomac River. But when he sends word to Washington that he's going to take an extra day, this leads to a very sharp rebuke from Union General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck, who tells Meade to attack Lee immediately, hold no councils of war, strike the enemy before he can escape. And so Meade launches his reconnaissance in force on the morning of July 14th, 1863. But when the Union soldiers go forward, they find that the Confederates have left. Their stout fortifications are empty. They're going to pick up some stragglers, but Lee has managed to get across the Potomac on the makeshift bridge that his engineers had finally completed, and the Potomac has fallen to a point where it's barely fordable. And so on the morning of July 14th, 1863, the Confederate Army is back in Virginia. And this is a huge disappointment for everybody in the North, everybody wearing blue. And it was a major disappointment for President Abraham Lincoln, who believed, rightly or wrongly, that Meade had let this golden opportunity to all but finish the war slip through his fingers. From the perspective of a lot of Meade's officers, Meade himself, when they got a look at the fortifications that the Confederates had constructed around Williamsport, they believed that to have attacked them would have been to meet a very bloody repulse. Therefore, most federal officers thought that Meade had acted wisely. The opinions of his troops were somewhat mixed. Certainly, some of them thought that an attack would have been a mistake. Others thought that there was a chance here to finish the war and wish they had been thrown into it. But all of that is now moot. The Confederates were gone. It's not quite over, of course, because Halleck sends a telegram to Meade expressing Lincoln's dissatisfaction at Lee's escape. Meade, who remembered only taking command of the army on June 28, just 3 days before the battle at Gettysburg, has been under enormous strain, and he has a very hair-trigger temper, and he sees that word dissatisfaction as censure. This is the president telling them he has not done what he should have done, not done what somebody else would have done. And Meade thinks that this is grossly unfair, and so he demands that he be replaced as commander of the Army of the Potomac, a job, he reminds Halleck, that he had not asked for, but he had been ordered to. Of course, firing the general who's just won this great battle, really the first Union general who can claim to unquestionably have beaten Robert E. Lee on the battlefield, is not in the cards. Halleck sends back a message changing the word dissatisfaction to disappointment and ordering Meade to pursue Lee. And so Meade gets a direct order from Halleck here. The enemy should be pursued and cut up wherever he may have gone. And so Meade has no questions about what he is expected to do. So he stays in command, and this will set to with Halleck and President Lincoln is usually the point where most histories of the Gettysburg campaign come to an end, because it's a very nice ending point after you've spent many hundreds of pages talking about a very complex and dramatic campaign, one of the greatest battles to be fought in the entire war. And so we'll bring down the curtain here, and the Gettysburg campaign is over. The problem with that is that the Gettysburg campaign was not over, nor was the war. The sun was going to come up on July 14th. Of 1863. The Army of the Potomac was still there. The Army of Northern Virginia was still there. The generals and the troops still have duties to perform. And in nobody's estimation, on either side of the Potomac, is this campaign concluded. Meade is expected to cross the river and continue the pursuit of Lee and try and force him into a finished battle. And Lee, of course, is going to have to be responsive to that threat. So what does Meade do? He begins to slide his troops off to the east toward Harper's Ferry and Berlin, Maryland, where he intends to cross the river. Even as he is doing that, Union forces are already entering the Shenandoah Valley. It's not that Meade had not been trying to get troops over the river, even as there had been this major concentration and confrontation on the north bank of the Potomac around Williamsport and Falling Waters. So on July 14th, about 3,500 troops under Brigadier General Negley came down off Maryland Heights and used a pontoon bridge built by the 50th New York Engineers to cross into Harper's Ferry. They chased away a small Confederate picket post, and so the first Union soldiers to enter Virginia after the Battle of Gettysburg do so on the very morning that Lee has gotten his army back into Virginia. At the same time, Major General Alfred Pleasonton, who's the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, has ordered Brigadier General David Gregg, who commands his 2nd Cavalry Division, to go to Harper's Ferry with 2 of his brigades, cross the river, and attempt to cut Lee's supply line south of the Potomac. Of course, these orders were issued before anybody in the Army of the Potomac knew that the Confederates had retreated back into Virginia. So Gregg believes that he's going to get below the river while Lee is still north of it and try and cut him off from a source of a resupply. And so the Federal Army is beginning to move even as Lee's army comes to a stop not very far from the Potomac around the towns of Darksville and Bunker Hill. And here Lee is going to pause to rest his troops, who are, of course, in very badly in need of rest, but also to pause because he's got a lot of booty and a lot of wounded and a lot of prisoners that he needs to shove southward through the Shenandoah Valley. He's got almost 20,000 head of cattle, as many sheep with him. He's got 4,000 Union prisoners. He's got something like 8,000 wounded. And all of this has to go down the Valley Pike. That's a very slow moving procession. And so Lee's going to pause in the northern reaches of the valley to rest his troops, to give all of this slow moving traffic a chance to gain some ground in front of him, and also to see what Meade is going to do. You're almost in exactly the same spot that the armies had been in after the Battle of Sharpsburg the year before. At that point, George McClellan had not entered Virginia until October. So he'd waited almost 6 weeks before following up his victory along Antietam Creek. Might Meade do the same thing? If Lee can do it, he would like to keep the Army of the Potomac close to its namesake river, and he is going to take advantage of the necessity of a pause to see if Meade is going to be aggressive or if Meade is going to be as timid as General McClellan had been. Of course, Meade knows that that's not in the cards. And so what Meade is going to do is he's going to, as I said, take his army here off to the east, and he plans to cross it over the Potomac River at Berlin and Harper's Ferry and to enter the Loudoun Valley. Now, Loudoun Valley is between the Blue Ridge here and the Bull Run Mountains here. It's parallel to the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley, of course, has the Shenandoah River, which runs along the west bank of the Blue Ridge here. And by taking his army into the Loudoun Valley, Meade is doing something that's very astute from a strategic perspective. He says it's pointless to chase Lee into the Shenandoah Valley, to trace him directly, because, of course, Lee has freedom of maneuver. He can retreat south. I'm never going to catch up to him and force him to fight. So if I want to try and bring Lee to battle, I'm going to put myself on his strategic flank. I'm going to use the mountains to protect my crossing of the river, and then I'm going to move south. And if I can, I'm going to take control of the passes in the Blue Ridge that Lee would have to use to get back into central Virginia, or somewhere around Culpeper Courthouse, probably the point from which he basically had started the Gettysburg campaign. And if Meade can move south fast enough and he can get through one of these gaps, there's an opportunity to shove the Army of the Potomac into the Shenandoah Valley and get it south of Lee and trap him against the south bank of the Potomac River in the way that he had been trapped against the north bank of the Potomac River before the night of July 13th and 14th. And so what you see here is the big overarching view of the campaign that is about to follow this final forgotten stage of the Gettysburg campaign that's going to consume the next 10 to 12 days. And so Meade is trying to bring his forces into the Loudoun Valley. It's going to take some days to get that done. But while he's moving in that direction, other federal forces are crossing the Potomac on the western side of the Shenandoah Valley. And these forces are under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin Kelly, who had been in charge of troops garrisoning the new state of West Virginia, protecting the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Kelly had been told when Lee began to invade Pennsylvania to gather his troops together and to move east to support the Army of the Potomac. This is going to take some time because the troops are very widely scattered, but he manages to get them together, about 6,000 men, a mix of infantry, cavalry, mounted infantry, artillery, and he moves them to the area of Williamsport, but he doesn't get there until July 15th of 63. And by the time he gets there, everybody's gone. The Confederates are south of the river. Meade is marching to the east toward Berlin and Harper's Ferry. And the great big battle that General Kelly thought he was marching to join apparently is not going to happen here. And so he telegraphs Halleck asking for orders, and Halleck tells him to cross the Potomac River near where he's at and, quote, seek to do some harm to the enemy. That is a very tricky proposition in terms of General Kelly's thinking. He's got 6,000 men. He doesn't know exactly how big the Army of Northern Virginia is. It's in fact down to about 45,000 troops, but 45,000 is a whole bunch more than 6,000. And Kelly is worried that if he crosses the river, he's isolated, he's vulnerable, he better be very careful. But orders are orders. And so he begins to cross the river around Cherry Run Ford, which is right here on the upper edge of this map, at a place called near where Cherry Creek runs into the Potomac. This is a picture of Cherry Run Ford in the 1880s. The Potomac River, of course, is swollen at this point to a width of 1,500 feet. So almost everything you see in this picture would have been underwater on July 15th of 1863. The current is moving very fast, and Kelly only has 3 small skiffs to try and get his 6,000 men, their wagons, their horses, their artillery over the river. It's going to be a back-breaking effort. It's going to take him 3 days to get his troops into the Shenandoah Valley. The current is so bad that on every trip, the boats are swept a half a mile downstream. And then they have to be brought to the other side and brought back upstream against the current in order for the crossing to continue. But Kelly is nothing if he's not determined. He manages to get that done. And by the evening of July 17th, he's up here in the northwestern reach of the Shenandoah Valley and beginning to move toward Hedgesville, which is going to become his base. On the other side of the Shenandoah, what's happening? Well, General Gregg has crossed into Harper's Ferry on the late afternoon of July 14th. There's been a small skirmish with Confederate cavalry. The next morning, Gregg takes 2 of his brigades. His 3rd brigade is still coming toward him. It's not with him at this point. It's been ordered to reinforce him, but it'll be another day before it arrives in the valley. Gregg marches toward Charlestown, seeking to find a way to cut Lee's supply line. As he gets close to Charlestown, he runs into the Confederate Cavalry Brigade of Grumble Jones and some of Stuart's horse artillery, and they put up a pretty stout resistance. So Gregg says, well, that's not the way I'm going to cut Lee's supply line. So he leaves a few troops to keep watch on these rebels, and he takes the rest of his force north to the little village of Shepherdstown, which is not very far away from Sharpsburg, Maryland. So this is to the northwest of Harper's Ferry, right on the banks of the Potomac River. Gregg sweeps into the town on the late afternoon of July 15, 63, captures a handful of Confederates and some supplies, and then spreads his troops out in an arc around the town, still looking for a way to cut Lee's supply line. Very quickly, however, he picks up rumors that the Army of Northern Virginia is very close by. It's maybe 20 miles away at best, perhaps closer, and it's not just rebel cavalry, it is the Confederate main body of infantry, which of course is nothing that General Gregg wants to tangle with. So he's sitting there in Shepherdstown trying to figure out what to do. And of course, he's not the only one aware of the tactical situation. Jeb Stuart has learned that a Yankee cavalry division is in Shepherdstown, and he has plotted its destruction. So on July 16th, 1863, Stuart brings 3 of his brigades to Shepherdstown to deal with David Gregg. And this is going to bring about a very tough cavalry fight on July 16th, the Battle of Shepherdstown. It's not one of these great cavalry battles in the sense of sweeping charges, because this area is not only very rugged, it's also thoroughly overrun with stout rail and stone fences. And so almost all of the combat is done on foot. The Confederates initially drive the most forward Union units backwards, but then Gregg's men take position on a wooded ridge behind a stone wall. The Confederates, who are led by Fitz Lee during most of this battle, because Stuart's been called back to Army headquarters, bring up their horse artillery. They pound the Union position, but it really doesn't do any good. Lots of Confederate attacks are pushed back. Very late in the day, final Confederate brigade reaches the field, and it allows the rebels to exploit a failed Union counterattack. And they cave in the Yankee right flank and drive it back about a quarter of a mile before the Union position stabilizes. So the battle comes to an end at darkness. Gregg is almost out of ammunition. He is out of rations, and he has been waiting for his 3rd Brigade under Colonel Pinnock Huey to arrive and reinforce him. Huey had no idea that Lee had crossed the Potomac, or that there was any urgency, so he sort of took his time, got into Harper's Ferry around noon on the 16th, and was resting his troops when an urgent courier arrived with word from Gregg that he was in a battle and he needed that 3rd Brigade. And so Huey started to the northwest, moving from Harper's Ferry toward Shepherdstown, but along the way, he runs into a company of Confederate cavalry, Company D of the 12th Virginia, and it had been picketing the area between Shepherdstown and Harper's Ferry when Gregg had swept north the day before. And as a consequence, this company had gotten cut off behind Union lines. Unfortunately for the rebels, this unit had been raised in this part of Virginia. It knew the terrain very well. And so instead of trying to get it back to its own line or panicking or something like that, it had spent the day laying incautious Federals, moving around in small groups, capturing wagons, that sort of stuff. And one of the wagons that had been captured was Gregg's headquarters wagon. And so this intrigues the Confederate officer in charge, who says, well, there's a Yankee brigade headquarters wagon here. There are a lot of Yankees somewhere. Let's go looking for them. And as a consequence of that, one of his patrols crosses path with Huey as he's moving toward Shepherdstown. Huey, having picked up word that the Confederates were very active in this area, is surprised to have run into rebels, and he halts his brigade and throws it into line of battle and deploys his artillery and prepares to receive an attack, which of course isn't going to happen. There are a lot of Confederates around him, maybe 100. They're grossly outnumbered. They're not going to make a foolish attack, but this freezes Huey in place for the rest of the day. And so it's after dark before he reaches Gregg's battered line near Shepherdstown. And what Huey tells Gregg is that there are a whole bunch of Confederates between the 2nd Cavalry Division and Harper's Ferry. In fact, we're surrounded, and we've got Confederates to the west of us, we got Confederates to the south of us, we got Confederates to the east of us, and a flooded Potomac River to the north of us. We're trapped. And the Confederates certainly considered Gregg trapped. They were laying careful plans to finish him off the next morning. But one of Gregg's scouts tells him that there's a narrow trail that traces the route of the Potomac back to Harper's Ferry. It's barely wide enough for a column of 2s, and in some places only wide enough for a column of 1s. But it is there, and Gregg decides that that is the only avenue of retreat that he has available to him. And so after midnight, he begins to pull his troops clandestinely off the line. They sneak away without the Confederates realizing that they're going. It's going to take them all night to get back to Harper's Ferry, but the Confederates are not going to realize that the Federals have escaped until the next morning, and their pursuit will be too late and ineffective. But nonetheless, the Battle of Shepherdstown, which one Federal cavalryman called one of the hardest fights that the cavalry had been in during the war up to this point, has been a success strategically for the rebels. If they had not destroyed Gregg's division, as they had hoped they would, they have shoved it back into Harper's Ferry, where it is not going to be a threat to Robert E. Lee. So as this is happening, Meade is closing in on Berlin. He's got pontoon bridge down at Harper's Ferry. His engineers are going to start to lay a bridge at Berlin. That's not as easy as it might sound, because with the river having swollen, the bridge train does not have enough pontoons and equipment to bridge the Potomac. The engineers, through Gouverneur Warren, who's the Army's chief engineer, have sent word back to Washington. We need another 700 feet of bridging material. By the way, be sure and send it by railroad, because the Confederates have damaged the B&O Canal and it's inoperative. The word that more bridging material is needed gets to DC, but somehow the part about send it by rail doesn't. And so the authorities in Washington dispatch the extra pontoons by the canal, which means they're not going to get there in time. Fortunately, the federal engineers have the windfall of Robert E. Lee's destroyed bridge from Williamsport, which had been broken up when the Confederates got south of the river, and its parts and pieces come sweeping down the Potomac River toward Berlin, and the federal engineers fish those parts and pieces out of the angry waters and use them to complete their bridge, so that they are able to allow the federal infantry to begin crossing there more or less on a schedule. The day after the first bridge is built, the additional bridging material shows up late, but still there. So the federal engineers are going to be able to build a second bridge for the Federals to cross the Potomac. And this, of course, is what the Army is going to do, but it is not necessarily what George Meade prefers to do. And he writes a letter to his wife, Margaret, who's a close confidant, on July 18th of 63, in which he says that the proper policy of the Lincoln administration would be happy to get Lee out of the North, happy to get Lee out of Maryland, let him alone. It's kind of fruitless for me to chase him. He's got freedom of maneuver. He's just going to run away in front of me. I'm not going to be able to bring him to battle. And beyond that, I don't even really have confidence that I can put my army into a pitched battle. We should pause in Maryland and not advance until I've been reinforced. I can reorganize this army and put it on such a footing that its advance is sure to be successful. Why go and risk a battle when you can't be 100% confident that you would win it? We should wait until we are better prepared. But if this is what Meade believes should be the policy of the government, he knows that that is not what the policy of the government is, and that he is expected to continue his pursuit begun at Gettysburg. And so at Berlin, Maryland, here's a picture of it. There are the two pontoons. He's going to take his army across the Potomac, and also he's going to get some of it over at Harper's Ferry, and they're going to swing around and then come through Key's Gap to join the rest of the army in the Loudoun Valley. So by night on July 18th, you've got the 2nd, the 3rd, the 1st, and the 5th Corps, Buford's Cavalry Division, the Artillery Reserve south of the river, the 6th and the 11th Corps, the 12th and Kilpatrick's Division waiting to cross. And the advance at first is kind of slow, kind of cautious. Obviously, he doesn't know where the Confederates are because he's basically lost complete contact with them once they've crossed the river. He assumes that Lee is retreating rapidly southward, looking to cross the Blue Ridge Mountains and get back into central Virginia. That would be the logical thing to do as far as Meade is concerned, but he doesn't know with certainty that this is what the rebels are doing. And so we first touch upon this real dearth of intelligence that both Meade and Lee are going to suffer through during the next 10 days. They have the Blue Ridge Mountains between their two armies and a flooded Shenandoah River. And there's very little contact between the armies. It's very difficult to get any kind of intelligence whatsoever. And so both generals are essentially going to be moving in the dark for most of this campaign. But if Meade doesn't know where Lee is, the same can be said for General Kelly on the western side of the Shenandoah Valley. But he has his orders, and his orders are to do some harm to the rebels. The question that Kelly has to answer is, where are the rebels and how many of them are there? And so on July 19th, he sends about 2,500 men under the command of Brigadier General William Averill, mostly infantry, some cavalry, a battery of artillery, towards Martinsburg, Virginia, today West Virginia. And he tells Averill to be careful. If there are no Confederates in Martinsburg, he's to occupy that place. If there's just a handful of Confederates, he's to occupy the place. But if there are a lot of Confederates between him and there, he is not to push it. Kelly doesn't want Averill to poke the beehive so that the overwhelming strength of the Army of Northern Virginia will swarm out and sting his small force to death. Averill gets most of the way to Martinsburg, pushing back Hampton's brigade of cavalry, which is now under the command of Colonel Lawrence Baker, following Hampton's wounding at Gettysburg. But just shy of Martinsburg, Ewell sends some infantry to support Baker, and the appearance of Confederate infantry convinces Averill that this is exactly the kind of scenario that he had been warned against. And so he begins to withdraw back toward Martinsburg. The Confederates are following them very slowly, and there's a day-long skirmish, very vigorous. But at the end of the day, the Federals are back where they started around Hedgesville. The Confederates have protected Martinsburg, but both sides now know where the other is, which is something they had not known earlier in the day. So you have a situation.
Please mute yourself. Please mute. You're being disruptive.
A single mom in East London and one of 4 sisters. I know.
Please mute yourself. You're being disruptive.
Okay, and so Kelly now knows that the Army of Northern Virginia is somewhere around Martinsburg or south of there. Ewell now knows that there is a federal force, which he estimates at about 10,000 men. It's up around Hedgesville. And this fighting on the 19th is going to have very significant repercussions. Even though it was a fight, it didn't amount to very much. On the other side of the Shenandoah Valley, Meade completes crossing the river on July 19th. He's pushing further south. He's got cavalry detachments from Kilpatrick's division that have seized Snicker's Gap. The first of the gaps he's after. He's got troops from Buford and Kilpatrick moving down the valley, now threatening Ashby's Gap, which is held only by a very small contingent of Confederate cavalry, most of which had been left behind when Lee swept north toward Gettysburg. So Meade is actually accomplishing what he had hoped to accomplish. He's got his army on the south side of the Potomac. He's got it in the Loudoun Valley safely, and he is successfully beginning to move that army in such a way that he is opening up at least the possibility of pushing through one of these gaps and getting south of Lee. Now, Lee's army, setting up here with Ewell's corps around Darksville, Hill and Longstreet's corps around Bunker Hill, has not gotten much in the way of reinforcement. But it has been strengthened by a single brigade, 1,200 troops under General Montgomery Corse. These troops had been part of Pickett's division, one of 2 brigades from Pickett's division that had been left behind during the Gettysburg campaign. And when news of the defeat at Gettysburg had reached Richmond on July 9th, Corse had been ordered into the valley to reinforce the Army of Northern Virginia. His men make a 100-mile march in the span of about 5 days through rain and mud. They get to Winchester in the late afternoon of July 19th, and he reports to Pickett. And Pickett says, well, look, your guys are tired. The roads are awful. There's no need for you to march north and rejoin us around Bunker Hill. Why don't you just keep your brigade in Winchester for the time being until we see what we're going to be ordered to do. And this very casual decision is going to turn out to have the most important repercussions for events going forward. Robert E. Lee, like George Meade, is trying to figure out what's going on without having any real information on the enemy. Lee, of course, is very good at sort of getting in the minds of Union generals, but he has only been dealing with Meade for a couple of weeks. And he supposes that the most dangerous thing that the Federals could do was to enter the Loudoun Valley, move rapidly south, try to get control of the mountain passes, and cut the Army of Northern Virginia off in the upper, the northern reaches, or the lower, geographically speaking, end of the valley. And although Lee has no evidence whatsoever that points toward the Army of the Potomac having crossed the river, other than reports of Union cavalry hovering around some of those mountain passes, he decides to act on the assumption that Meade is a very good general, and he will therefore do the thing that is most dangerous to the Confederate Army. So on the late afternoon of July 19th of 63, he writes James Longstreet, commanding the First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he asked him to take his army to the Shenandoah River on the other side of Ashby's Gap. If he sees that that's a good place to cross the river, he can do that, but if it doesn't look a good place, then he should go down to Chester's Gap near Front Royal, across the river there, and then move through the mountain passes and return to Culpeper County and take a position somewhere along the upper Rappahannock River, so that he would be in a position to block any Union thrust toward Richmond, because this is the other danger that Lee has to consider, is that Meade will simply ignore what the Army of Northern Virginia is doing and move east into central Virginia, try and cross the Rappahannock and maybe even the Rapidan, and put himself strategically between the Army of Northern Virginia and the Confederate capital. So Lee has ordered Longstreet to move. Longstreet will begin that movement the next morning on July 20th. And while Longstreet is preparing to move that same evening, George Meade gets roundabout word about the fighting that had gone on near Martinsburg the day before. And this comes to him sort of obliquely from a garrison commander in Hagerstown, Maryland, who had talked to one of Averell's officers. Meade has lost all telegraphic communication with the North when he crossed the Potomac, so he's really kind of out of touch. But this message gets to him by courier, and for the first time, Meade has some solid information about where the Army of Northern Virginia is. And to his surprise, he finds out that it's around Bunker Hill and Darksville, that the Confederates are near Martinsburg and threatening Kelly's forces near Hedgesville. And this flabbergasts Meade, because this indicates that the Army of Northern Virginia is not doing what he thought it would be doing, what it would be logical for it to do, and that would be to retreat as rapidly southward through the Shenandoah Valley as possible, to cross the mountains and get back into central Virginia before the Union Army has a chance to intervene. And this stunning news suddenly makes Meade remember something that he had read the day before in a Southern newspaper, and that was a report that massive reinforcements are being sent to the Army of Northern Virginia. The troops are coming to reinforce it from Tennessee and from the Carolinas. And when Meade had gotten those, he'd sent word to Halleck asking if this is true. Halleck had sent word back saying, "Don't worry, not a man is going to come to reinforce Lee. You're infinitely superior than him." And Meade had taken Halleck at his word, but now Meade has to consider that maybe these reports are true, because why else would Lee still be in the northern reaches of the Shenandoah Valley? There's no reason for him to stay there. There's no reason for him to put his army at risk from the very kind of maneuver that Meade is conducting, unless those stories are true. And Meade is right in fearing that the Army of Northern Virginia is being massively reinforced. And if reinforcements are coming to Lee, Lee could be preparing to reinvade the North, to cross the Potomac again, or perhaps even more frightening, he would let Meade continue to plow south into the Loudoun Valley, and once Meade is far enough south, Lee could cross from the Shenandoah into the Loudoun Valley in sort of the mirror image of the kind of threat that Meade is hoping to levy against Lee, and get between Washington and the Army of the Potomac, cut it off from its source of reinforcement and resupply. Is that what Lee's planning to do? There's no evidence one way or the other, but the fact that he's lingering in a place that he shouldn't linger seems to suggest that this is at least a possibility. And with a battered Army of the Potomac, Meade is not willing to take any chances. Lee has proven his audacity too many times in the past to simply discount the idea that he would do the most audacious thing that could be imagined. And so, uncertain as to what the Army of Northern Virginia is doing, Meade decides to take counsel of caution, and he orders his infantry to stop its southward movement until he can get some intelligence clarity. The cavalry will keep going south. It will keep aiming toward these mountain passes, but the infantry is going to stop and wait until Meade can figure out what Lee is really up to. And as a result, the infantry of the Army of the Potomac is not going to take another step south for 36 critical hours. And giving Robert E. Lee 36 hours of grace usually doesn't work to your advantage, and it's not going to work to the federal advantage here as well. So on July 20th, Longstreet's corps begins to move toward Chester's Gap. So Longstreet leaves Bunker Hill. He goes over here to Millwood on the other side of the Shenandoah River from Ashby's Gap, and concludes there's no threat here, even though federal cavalry has seized the gap earlier in the day. And so he plans to continue his march tomorrow down to Chester's Gap, where he can cross the mountains and go back toward Culpeper. While Longstreet is marching from Bunker Hill through Winchester down to Millwood, Force's brigade, which remember had been left at Winchester, has been directed to go straight to Front Royal. And by the end of the day, he's camping at Cedarville, which is only about 5 miles away from Front Royal. So this is just sort of a routine thing. Hey, you're closer here than there. You might as well go that way instead of this way. But again, this is going to have enormous consequences for what's going to take place the next day. Lee, in the interim, has sent word back to Ewell and A.P. Hill to prepare to follow Longstreet soon. And everybody is going to be heading toward the same place, and that place is Front Royal. And Front Royal matters a great deal because sitting on the western side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Front Royal is the spot where two gaps through the mountains come together. And that's Manassas Gap here to the north, where you see that number 1, and Chester's Gap here, where you see that number 3. This is a drawing by Edwin Forbes in 1862. If you want to see it on a map where it's a little bit clearer, here you go. So here's the North Fork of the Shenandoah, the South Fork coming together at Front Royal to form the Shenandoah River. Remember, this is all flooded. There's the little town of Front Royal. Here's Chester's Gap. There's Manassas Gap. And here are the Blue Ridge Mountains. And controlling these passes is of critical importance because Lee wants to move through Chester's Gap to get out of the valley and back into central Virginia. Meade is envisioning being able to push through Manassas Gap into the valley at Front Royal and cut Lee off in the northern reaches of the valley where he might be destroyed. So on the morning of July 21st, 1863, you have a situation where Union cavalry, a brigade under the command of Wesley Merritt, is moving into Manassas Gap and going to the apex of the pass around the little town of Linden. The Corse's brigade passes through Front Royal. He sends most of his troops and the little artillery has with him to Chester's Gap, which of course is the one the Confederates plan to use but Manassas Gap has to be watched. And so he detaches the 17th of Virginia Cavalry, infantry, under the command of Colonel Robert Simpson, to go up and to guard Manassas Gap. And that's an inspired choice because Simpson is a pre-war militia officer. He's a good regimental commander, but he was from Front Royal, and one of his companies was raised in Front Royal. So he knows this terrain very well. And he marches his troops up toward Linden, stopping at a place called Wapping House, which was a former stagecoach stop that had basically been put out of business by the advent of the Manassas Gap Railroad. And just as Simpson's 250 men stack their muskets and send out their skirmishers, the lead contingent of Merritt's Cavalry Brigade shows up on the scene and it attacks them. And this begins a day of fighting in Manassas Gap. Simpson loses about 25, 30 of his men as prisoners in that initial Yankee cavalry surge, but he rallies his troops very quickly, and they put up a very stout fight. Merritt is going to progressively throw more and more of his troops into the battle, and the Confederates are going to manage to hold against very serious odds. And fortunately for them, at the start of the engagement, they sent a courier racing back to Front Royal with orders to find Longstreet's corps and ask for reinforcements. And as that courier gets to Front Royal, he runs into the advance of Pickett's brigade, or Pickett's division, which is leading Longstreet's corps. And Pickett, understanding that there's a crisis at foot, hurries his troops through Front Royal and sends one brigade under Cabell, this is Armistead's old brigade, to reinforce Simpson in Manassas Gap, and sends his other two brigades, the former brigades of Garnett and Kemper under Peyton and Mayo, to reinforce Corse's brigade in Chester's Gap, where there's been some light skirmishing with Gamble's Federal cavalry from Buford's division. And so the Confederate reinforcements show up here just in time to blunt what Merritt has been trying to do, which is get to Front Royal. The Confederates have put up a stout resistance that surprised the Yankees, and Confederate prisoners have been telling very good lies. And so they tell Merritt that they are part of a division of troops instead of a brigade. And Merritt believes that, and he passes word back up that there's a division of Confederate infantry inside Manassas Gap. And of course, Gamble is sending word back that he's run into Confederates at Chester's Gap as well. If Union infantry had kept moving south on July 21st, there might have been Federal foot soldiers to slide into these two gaps that night to block them up and deny the Confederates use of them. But remember, Meade's infantry has spent the day of July 20th or July 21st basically taking it easy and not really doing much of anything. So the Federal cavalry is kind of out here on its own. At the other end of the Shenandoah Valley, Lee has sent word to A.P. Hill telling him to follow Longstreet down through Chester's Gap. And he sent word to Ewell saying that you'll probably follow in a few days, but for now, I want you to stay where you are. And if there's anything that I need to know, about the enemy, be sure to tell me. Well, you'll have something to tell Lee. And so on the 20th, he informed Lee about the fight the previous day around Martinsburg. And he says, look, there are about 10,000 Federals up around Hedgesville, and I would like to go destroy them. And Lee likes the sound of that. He likes the sound of Ewell being aggressive. And although he doesn't think Kelly's force is quite that strong, he gives permission. And so on the afternoon of July 20th, Ewell and his division commanders, Robert Rhodes, Allegheny Johnson, and Jubal Early met in Martinsburg at the home of one of his adjutant generals, a very lovely plantation called Boydville. And here they plotted the destruction of Kelly's force. And the plan was for Rhodes and Johnson to move directly north from Darksville, basically moving precisely against Hedgesville from the direction that the Federals would expect. But at the same time that this is happening, Early and his division, with Hampton's cavalry brigade under Baker, will have slipped into Back Creek Valley on the other side of North Mountain the evening before, and they will advance up the valley to strike the Federals from the rear. And so while Ewell's main force is attracting Kelly's attention, Early's flanking force will slide around and hit it from behind, and the Federals will be caught in a vice and they'll be destroyed. The very good plan. It might have worked, but there was a problem. And that problem was that there was a black slave who was tending to the needs of the Confederate officers at Boydville. And that slave belonged to the Pendleton family, who were Unionists. And when he had been sent to Boydville, his owner, Lucinda Pendleton, had told him to keep his eyes and ears open when he's around Confederate generals. And so after the strategy conference, he comes back, he tells Mrs. Pendleton what he's heard. She tells the slave to go north and warn Kelly. The black man, of course, is not allowed through Confederate picket line. So she sends her son, her 10-year-old son, with an empty basket claiming he's going to go pick blackberries. And he gets through. And he gets up to Kelly. He says, "You're all going to be killed. The Confederates are coming after you." And at first, Kelly thinks the young man is spinning a yarn, but he decides to be careful, and he sends cavalry patrols into Back Creek Valley, and they find the Confederates camped around Tomahawk Springs, and suddenly Kelly knows that the threat is very real, and so he begins a retreat that night. And on the morning of July 21st, as the Confederates launch the final movements to destroy him, he gets across the Potomac River, and Hampton's cavalry brigade shows up just in time to see the last boatload of Yankees get back into Maryland. So on July 21st in Manassas Gap, the Confederates had fought a very important delaying action, and they managed to keep the Federals from beginning to come through the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the other side of the Shenandoah Valley, disappointment, but you have shoved Kelly out of your way. You don't have to worry about him anymore. But the fact that the Confederates had launched an offensive toward Kelly is, when the news of it gets to Meade, going to play into his concern that Lee is being reinforced and is preparing to take the offensive. Doesn't this look like a Confederate offensive movement? And so Meade's getting conflicting intelligence now. Some of the intelligence points toward the Confederates going over to the offensive, but some of the observers he's gotten up in the mountains now looking into the Shenandoah Valley are seeing long columns of Confederate infantry and massive columns of wagons streaming south toward Winchester and Front Royal. And so, which is it? Is Lee about to assume the offensive, or is Lee retreating? Meade can't know with certainty, and he doesn't want to move until he has clarity on the situation. So on the night of July 21st, 1863, here's the situation. The Union infantry is still sitting in its camps. It hasn't moved for more than a day. The Confederates have forces in Manassas and Chester's Gap, but the Federals have a cavalry brigade in each of those to try and block the passes. Hill has marched south to Winchester. Robert E. Lee and his headquarters accompany them. Ewell has turned Rhodes and Johnson's divisions around and taken them back to Darksville, but Early, along with Hampton's brigade, is up at Hedgesville. So now they're the northernmost part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they're some distance away from Ewell and the rest of his corps, and that too is going to have consequences. So on the morning of July 22nd, everything is kind of poised for potentially a great big battle as both the Union and Confederate armies converge toward Front Royal. At noon, Meade is finally going to get enough information from his Signal Corps observers in the mountains to conclude that Lee is in fact retreating, not going over to the offensive. But on that same day, the Confederates are now beginning to push their way through Manassas through Chester's Gap, while they continue to hold at Manassas Gap. So Hill is going to come in. He's going to replace Longstreet's units in Manassas Gap. As Longstreet begins to push through Chester's Gap, he runs into William Gamble's cavalry brigade. with a battery of artillery. And although the Confederates, of course, vastly outnumber the Federals in this narrow mountain pass, those numbers are all but useless. And the Confederate brigade at the front of Longstreet's column under William Woodford looks at the ground that Gamble is holding and says, wow, that's going to be tough ground to attack. It'd probably be pretty bloody to try and shove the Yankees out of the way. And so Woodford proposes that instead they outflank the Federals. And what he proposes is sending Pickett's division, or at least the two brigades of it that are with him, over the mountains to come in and hit the Federal cavalry from the rear and the flank. And when Woodford sees Pickett come in to do that, he will start a frontal attack. And Longstreet agrees to this plan, even though he knows it will take almost an entire day for Pickett's troops to get into position. Obviously, he's not feeling very threatened by whatever the Army of the Potomac is doing. And so Pickett's men make this long flank march. They get into position. They begin to move against Gamble. Woodford begins to move against him at the same time. Gamble realizes that he's been put into a trap, and he puts his men on his horses and he gallops away. And he manages to escape. This is very disappointing to General Woodford. Longstreet's not surprised that men on horses are going to be able to run away from men on foot, but nonetheless, at almost no cost, the Confederates have cleared the exit to Chester's Gap, and now Longstreet's Corps and Hill's Corps begin streaming through the mountains toward the upper Rappahannock River and Culpeper County. So here we are at night on July 22nd. Longstreet is beginning to go through Chester's Gap. Hill's right behind him. Benning's brigade is holding Manassas Gap. Stuart has brought most of his cavalry down toward the Gap. Ewell has taken Rhodes and Johnson's divisions to Winchester. Early's now backed up to Bunker Hill. And Meade has finally concluded that he can resume his march south. And so he's beginning to shove his infantry toward Manassas Gap. He's still being careful. So he leaves the 12th Corps at Snicker's Gap, the 2nd Corps backed up by the 5th Corps at Ashby's Gap, just in case he's wrong. And Lee suddenly goes over to the offensive and tries to shove his way into the Loudon Valley through those. But the 3rd Corps and the 6th Corps are directed toward Manassas Gap. And so by the evening of July 22nd, the 3rd Corps is almost at the entrance to the Gap, the 6th Corps not far away. And that night, a division from the 3rd Corps is sent into Manassas Gap to relieve Merritt's cavalry brigade. And the next morning, the rest of the 3rd Corps, and then followed by the 5th Corps, is going to go streaming into Manassas Gap. Federal observers up in the mountains have gotten a little bit confused about what the Confederates are doing, but even more confused about what Confederates they're looking at. So Meade knows that Merritt and Gamble have been facing Longstreet's troops. And so Longstreet's Corps is somewhere down around here. But looking through from the mountains through a hazy atmosphere down into the Shenandoah Valley, the Federal observers have come to believe that Ewell's Corps, or at least the 2 divisions at Winchester, are in fact A.P. Hill's troops, which they've lost track of, and that Early's sole division up here at Bunker Hill is Ewell's entire corps. So Meade is misconstruing the situation here because he's getting bad intelligence. Both Longstreet and Hill, with Lee's headquarters, are in Chester's Gap, beginning to redeploy into Central Virginia. Only Ewell's Corps is north of that point. But Meade believes that 2/3 of the Army of the Potomac is around Winchester and Bunker Hill. So if he could shove his way through Manassas Gap and seize Front Royal, he might catch both Hill and Ewell in the northern reaches of the Shenandoah Valley. Longstreet will elude him, but if he can get the Army of Northern Virginia into the valley and throw its entirety against 2/3 of Lee's army, he might destroy 2 of 3 rebel corps and take the war a long step closer to a successful conclusion. So on the morning of July 23rd, Federal infantry begins to move into Manassas Gap, even as Longstreet and Hill's Corps and then Stewart's cavalry are moving eastward through Chester's Gap. So you have this very interesting situation where Meade is trying to shove his forces west toward Front Royal through Manassas Gap, and just a few miles to the south, with the mountains in between them, Longstreet, Hill, and Stewart are pushing in the opposite direction. So like two ships passing in the night. But Meade does not know this. Meade thinks that there's a chance to trap and destroy two of Lee's corps. And the man who is in charge of being the spearhead of that effort is Major General William F. French, who has recently taken command of the Third Corps following the Gettysburg wounding of our old friend General Sickles, who Meade does not care much for. French has been a brigade and division commander, but his fighting's all been done in the Second Corps. He's a newcomer to the Third Corps. He'd been sent to take command of the garrison of Harper's Ferry at the start of the Gettysburg campaign, so he missed that battle, but he brings that garrison to reinforce the Army of the Potomac as it marches in pursuit of Lee following that great battle. And Meade assigns this fresh division to the Third Corps, which has been so badly mauled at Gettysburg. And by seniority, then French takes command. French is, in fact, the third ranking major general in the Army of the Potomac behind Meade and Sedgwick. French has had a hard war. He got to attack the sunken road at Antietam. He got to attack the stone wall at Fredericksburg. He got to try and stop Stonewall Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville. And through all of those experiences, French has learned a good portion of caution. And I think we can understand why. Under those circumstances, he might be inclined to be careful, especially since he's commanding a corps for the very first time. And so French comes up toward Linden in Manassas Gap. And while he's arriving, a Confederate brigade under, this is Wright's brigade of Georgians from Hill's Corps, has marched into Manassas Gap to relieve Benning's brigade of responsibility for protecting that key terrain. And Wright's not with them that day. Wright has gotten himself in a fight with his division commander, Richard Anderson, who's arrested him. And so Colonel Edward Walker is commanding this brigade of Georgians that had been badly shot up at Gettysburg. So it's only 600 men strong. And when it gets into Manassas Gap and Walker talks to Benning, Benning says, well, it's quiet here. There's nothing to worry about. There's a brigade of Yankee cavalry a mile or so away in Linden, but they're not inclined to cause any trouble. And so Benning marches away. Walker deploys his troops into two parallel lines, putting the 3rd Georgia Infantry and 2 companies of the 2nd Georgia Battalion on high ground called Wapping Heights in a skirmish line. And then about 600 yards behind them, the 48th Georgia, the 22nd Georgia, and the last 2 companies of the 2nd Georgia Battalion onto a skirmish line on a parallel ridge. This whole area is kind of known as Wapping Heights. And the Confederates deploy, and for a while, everything is very calm. And then to the horror of Colonel Walker, suddenly an entire Federal infantry corps shows up in front of him. Not Yankee cavalry anymore, and not just a brigade, but an entire corps. And he has Signalman wigwag back a message toward Front Royal that he needs help and he needs it fast. By this point, Richard Ewell and Robert Rhodes have gotten into Front Royal. They're moving ahead of Rhodes and Johnson's infantry. Those 2 men race into Manassas Gap to see what Walker is talking about. And they get up here and they look through their binoculars and they see that, in fact, Colonel Walker is not making things up. There's maybe 20,000 Federal infantry in front of his 600 Georgians, and the divisions of Rhodes and Johnson are still marching south from Winchester. They're like 20 miles away. from Manassas Gap. And so there's a great danger here that French would overwhelm Walker, plow through to Front Royal, and cut the Confederate Second Corps off in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, Meade thinks he might cut off both Hill and Ewell. We know that Hill's already in Chester's Gap going the other way, but there's a real chance here for the Federals to destroy a third of the Army of Northern Virginia. Understanding the danger, Ewell tells Colonel Walker that he's got to hold his ground if it costs him every man that he has. Hold fast and I'll send reinforcements. And he and Rhodes go galloping back to hurry up their troops. And so now Walker and his Georgians are faced with trying to stymie the efforts of an entire Federal Corps. They're lucky, however, in a number of ways. First off, the terrain here is very, very rugged. The mountains, wherever the ground is smooth and conducive to farming, have been cleared. But on the steep sides of these hills, there are lots of brambles and trees and that kind of stuff. In addition to this pretty good defensive terrain, there are a lot of loose rocks around that they can stack into makeshift breastworks. But even more in their favor is the fact that General French is new to Corps command and he is inclined toward caution. He looks at the ground to the left and right of his corps as it marches into Manassas Gap. He sees these towering mountains covered with dense forest, and he imagines that they could be filled with Confederate infantry. It's almost like he saw too many of those 1950s Westerns where, you know, the cavalry rise into the Box Canyon and then the Indians are suddenly on all the mountains, you know, silhouetted against the horizon. And so as he marches into this kind of terrain, he's very fearful that he's walking into a trap. So he spends lots of time detaching regiments and batteries to guard this little road or that little road, or to climb up onto that precipice to make sure that there are no rebels there. He's really disinclined to push things until George Sykes and the 5th Corps get up behind him, but it's going to take some hours for them to do that. And so his caution is going to prove incredibly helpful to the Georgians. Eventually, about 11 o'clock in the morning, so almost half the day's gone away now, and the Federals haven't pushed at all, General French sends a skirmish line out to contest Wapping Heights. And so a prolonged skirmish that's going to go on for 4 hours begins. And the troops are pot-shotting away at each other, not really inflicting very many casualties, although Colonel Walker is hit badly in the leg, forced to leave the battlefield, and Captain Charles Andrews of the 3rd Georgia takes command of the brigade. The fighting is sort of lackadaisical, and for men who had seen the horrors of Gettysburg, this was quite the contrast to the fight in Pennsylvania. It was almost a gentlemanly contest. It made even more so by the fact that both of these armies are almost out of food. So the soldiers are very hungry, but they're fighting in a region that is simply overrun with blackberries. There are blackberry bushes everywhere. And the men on both sides of the battle line have basically been living off the blackberries for several days. And so the way this fighting went is a soldier would load his musket, he would shoot, he would grab a fistful of blackberries, eat them, reload his musket, and shoot. And this is going on both sides. One soldier said it was like almost opera buffet kind of combat. And this goes on until 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, the head of Sykes' 5th Corps is finally within sight. General Meade has come up, although he's not going to interfere in operations. And at this juncture, General French tells his leading division commander, Hobart Ward, to go ahead and push the rebels off Wapping Heights. It's something the Federals could have done 4 hours ago, but just now is the order given. And so Ward pulls 2 of his skirmish regiments together, forms an assault column, advances, and very easily pushes the Confederates off of Wapping Heights. But it's not a panic. The Confederates go retreating back 600 yards to their second line in what one Union participant called a gentle cow trot. So they're hardly scared. The Federals sweep up onto Wapping Heights, but then they see that there's another Confederate line 600 yards to the west on even more formidable terrain. For Captain Andrews and the Georgians, this is a huge success. Andrews has conducted the fight very capably. He's very proud of his men for managing to hold out against an entire Union corps for most of the day. And as the Confederates pull back to this line, they hear that Rhodes' division is coming through Front Royal. Johnson's division is right behind them, having made a forced march through incredible heat. This whole campaign is conducted with temperatures in the 90s, and humidity is very high. So this is really rough stuff for the troops. But having gotten Wapping Heights now, French decides that he wants this second piece of high ground, and he orders the Excelsior Brigade under the command of Francis Spinola, who's a replacement for the normal commander who's on sick leave. Spinola is a political general. He has no military talent whatsoever, but he gets the job. Fortunately, he has very good troops, and Spinola is at least brave. So he goes into the valley between these two hills, and then he launches an attack up the very steep hillside. In some places, almost absolutely perpendicular against the Confederate skirmish line. And as the Federals advance, they are taking fire not only from the Georgians in front, but the sharpshooter battalions of Rhodes' division have arrived on the scene and taken position to the north and are firing into the Federal flank. So the Federals are taking fire from several directions, and in some places, the ground is so steep that Yankee soldiers are having to crawl on their hands and knees to get up. They're grabbing small trees and stuff to pull themselves forward. And one of the interesting things about this is that Rhodes' troops are coming into line behind the Confederates. They're on high ground. All the Federal troops over here are on high ground, and they're looking down on this fight. And both sides are cheering their comrades like this is a football game, like they're in a stadium looking down on the field. The Excelsiors managed to break the Confederate line. It is, after all, very thin and almost in ammunition. Spinola is wounded and knocked out of the fight. A lot of the Yankee troops are hit and killed or wounded. The Confederates are forced to retreat, so the Federals get this high ground. But by the time they get it, the situation now has changed completely, because Rhodes has got his division into position. He's got a brigade over here to reinforce right. Johnson's division has shown up at Front Royal. Longstreet is completely through Manassas Gap. Hill is now on his way through. And although French has managed to get right up to the last barrier between him and Front Royal, it's night now. And so he's not going to be able to do anything more. So what's the situation as far as General Meade understands it? General Meade has intelligence that he's got prisoners from all three Confederate infantry corps. Obviously, over the preceding days, he captured troops from Longstreet. Now he's got troops from Hill, courtesy of Wright's fight, but he's also got some prisoners from Ewell. And his observers have seen some Confederate troops leave Chester's Gap and come back to Front Royal. Now, this is, in fact, Stuart's horse artillery that got tired of the traffic jam here and decides it's going to take a different route down the valley to cross the mountains. But so Federal observers are seeing some Confederate troops come out of Chester's Gap toward Front Royal. They still think that Ewell's corps, which is marching from Winchester toward Front Royal, Early's division is in fact Ewell's entire corps. And so Meade believes that he has almost the whole Army of Northern Virginia in front of him here. And if he can shove his way through Manassas Gap the next day, he has a chance to cut most of it off and destroy it. So he's already got the 5th Corps in the map. Now he orders the 2nd Corps and the 12th Corps to come up and prepare to drive through Manassas Gap the next day. French is ordered to attack first thing in the morning. And that evening, Meade concentrates about 35,000 infantry, 2.5 corps around the little village of Linden. And there were, in fact, so many Federals in this space that it was said that men could not find space to lay down. They had to sit with their backs up against each other. It is so crowded here. And Meade is concentrating this giant effort to shove through Manassas Gap, capture Front Royal, and cut off a chunk of the Army of Northern Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley on July 23rd. He does have some worries, though. He's running very low on rations. He's had no resupply since he's crossed the Potomac, and now he's only got a day or two's worth of food left, and he has to send an order to his officers to cut rations, to conserve food, because if we're going to have a big battle and then try and capitalize on this battle that we hope to win, we need to make our food supply last as long as we possibly can. But the Federals go to bed that night in their hungry, overcrowded, uncomfortable conditions, thinking that tomorrow there might begin the battle that will be the actual culmination of the Gettysburg campaign. But we know that's not going to happen, because Hill and Longstreet have already gone through Manassas Gap toward Culpeper Courthouse. Early, no longer needed, is told to divert through Strasburg, go down to New Market, and cross the mountain at Fisher's Gap. And that evening, Rhodes and Johnson pull out of Manassas Gap, march through Front Royal, and make camp below the town. And at dawn the next day, they are marching hard toward Luray. And by the time that the Federals push through or begin their advance the next morning, the Confederates are gone. And so the Excelsiors send forward their skirmishers, and they go 3 miles without finding anything, with a few Confederate dead and a few stragglers. Word goes back to Meade that there are no rebels in front of them. Meade suspects what has happened, but he orders French to go ahead and push through Front Royal, but he tells everybody else to hold pat until he finds out what's actually going on. French gets his leading units to Front Royal just in time to see the distant dust cloud of Ewell's corps disappear over the horizon. And Meade now realizes that the Confederates have once again gotten away from him. And he's going to have to send yet another message to Henry Halleck and Abraham Lincoln. Having promised that the decisive battle of the war was about to be fought at Williamsport, he had to report that Lee had gotten away. Now, having promised that he's about to fight that decisive battle at Front Royal, he must again report that Lee has gotten away. For the Army of the Potomac, almost out of supplies, there's no option now but to pivot to the east and to march hard on Warrenton, where a connection can be made with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, and supplies of all kind, which are desperately needed, rushed to the Army from the depots in Washington. So the Federals are going to march north. This is Alfred Wode's drawing of them leaving Manassas Gap. They're going to head toward Warrenton. Lee is, of course, marching toward Culpeper Courthouse, and suddenly we have some 23 miles separating the two armies, as well as the Rappahannock River. And this is actually the point where the Gettysburg campaign is going to come to an end, not on the morning of July 14th along the banks of the Potomac, but around July 24, 25 on either side of the Rappahannock River in central Virginia. And that brings us to the end of our story.